The House Rules Committee met today to determine the rules for debate of a number of measures that will come to the floor of the House of Representatives this week. Coming up next on C-SPAN 2, you'll see the committee debate the rule for a proposal to establish a House Administrator. The Administrator would oversee certain executive functions for the House of Representatives, including financial services that had been performed by the House Bank. Republican members are expected to introduce an alternative plan, which would give the Administrator greater power to audit and investigate House executive agencies. We begin our coverage of today's House Rules Committee hearing at the point where they start debate on the House Administrator plan. Earlier, the committee had completed non-controversial work on the Older Americans Act and on a proposal for campaign finance reform.
I have an opening statement I'd like to give while we're waiting for Mr. Rose. Now more than ever, the American people are looking to Congress for help and relief from the problems that currently plague our society. These are problems ranging from untenable unemployment to adequate research funding for AIDS, to finding ways to help those currently without health insurance face the crisis of illness. But instead of seeing legislative action on these pressing concerns, the American people grow weary and disgusted as they watch us squabble and position and point fingers on embarrassing internal housekeeping concerns. I'm as embarrassed as anyone that I am among the majority of my colleagues who wrote checks that resulted in overdrafts. It is true that these overdrafts were neither willful or intentional, just as it is true that no taxpayers' monies were involved and no laws of the House rules were broken. It is also true that the House Dispersing Office was a badly managed system, but that's really not the point. The point is that the true damage caused by our flawed administrative procedures results in the continuing erosion of public confidence in elected leaders and the lost opportunities for this House to act on the issues of the day because our members are preoccupied with these embarrassing episodes. We are not members of a royal pedigree with a birthright to govern, complete with kingly perks and special privileges. We are just regular men and women who are freely elected by the public to serve their interests and maintain their trust. But due to distracting issues such as those addressed in this reform package, we are prevented from serving the public's interest and maintaining their trust that sadly has been eroding over the years. We have no one to blame for this current state of affairs but ourselves. And quite frankly, I'm tired of the senseless bickering and finger-pointing that has gone on in the last months, be it at our honorable speaker, at each other, the media, or even our spouses. For that kind of behavior, it gets us no closer to reform, but merely continues to distract this House from the business it must conduct. Now, make no mistake about it. This reform package is a major step forward. It reflects thoughtful discussions by both Republicans and Democrats. It may not be what everyone wants, but it is without a doubt a major step forward. It will bring the House management systems into the 21st century and will help this institution avoid such embarrassing, degrading, and time-consuming episodes that have taken up so much of the House's valuable time. The flawed policies and perks that have been part of this institution for over a century are being phased out, and that's good. However, I hope with my whole heart that once these reforms are made, this House will move on to the real business at hand, the things that we're elected to do. Quite frankly, you get down to it, whether or not we raise prices in the House stationery store or whether we ask H&R Block to manage this place makes no difference to the lives of the people we represent. Now, that's not to say that American people don't want us to run a tight ship. They do. And I know they are frustrated, as we are, at the stories about the House Dispersing Office, the Post Office, and other internal embarrassments. but I would respectfully suggest that the American people are far more frustrated at this government's inability to deal with issues that impact them. People are really hurting. As important as this reform package is, and believe me, I think it's very important, nothing we are doing today will put anyone to work, provide anyone with health care, or put anyone through school. So I think it's time to move on, and I don't want this House to become mired for weeks and months on end with debate on internal housekeeping. And I certainly don't want the House to become a place where comparatively trivial issues are debated passionately and the important ones not at all. We are improving this institution, and with this reform package, we will continue to look at ways to make this place a better place. But the House's principal concern should be issues that impact the lives of our constituents, and I sincerely hope that once we've dispensed with this legislation, we can get back on track and do what we're elected to do. Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Chairman, and just a few opening comments, and let me just say that you, Mr. Chairman, are one of the most respected members of this House, and the statement that you've just read certainly, I think, reflects much of our own views on this side of the aisle, except when you say that this will make substantial progress towards cleaning up the problems and restoring American belief in this Congress. And as I look at this bill that is being put before us, it's a very, very thin, 8-page, double-spaced, large type document. And I think that speaks for itself, because really what this bill does is absolutely nothing. I believe that these so-called reforms, and much of the intent is commendable, but when you look at the language involved in this bill, it really does absolutely nothing. 2 years from now, we could be right back in the same boat that we're in today. Nothing in this bill will prevent the same kind of scandals that have taken place that has just brought the prestige and the esteem of this House down to rock bottom. And much of that problem has to do with the committees that operate the ministerial duties. The post office, the bank, the folding room, and all of these non-political or non-legislative functions of the House. And we are never going to correct the problems and the potential abuses unless both political parties are allowed to have total input into this structure. And one of the big problems is, and I know that sometimes the Democrats don't like to hear this, but when you have any political party that controls this body for 40 years, and it is run on a totally patronage concept, which it is and which it has been, and the Republicans did that in the years prior to your 40 years of control, because that's the way things were done in the back room. But the truth is, we aren't doing anything to undo that today. As far as the House Administration Committee is concerned, it is not 50-50. We are not going to have equal input and therefore share equal blame. The Inspector General, which we were pushing so hard, you've got some language in here, and as I read it, I don't see any teeth in that. I don't see where this member of Congress could go to that Inspector General and say, I think there's a problem in that post office. I think there is still cocaine being sold. I think there are problems of embezzlement. And there is nothing that says that that Inspector General is going to undertake anything. When you look at the council, yes, the language in here says that you're going to let us have some kind of a position in the council's office. We have that already. And it doesn't work when there is a major problem that comes up where the membership, or at least the Republican leadership, ought to know about it. We're not being informed. We haven't been informed. Nothing in this bill corrects that. The doorkeeper. Now, I happen to love the doorkeeper that we have here. He's from Buffalo, New York, and he's a great guy. But that is a patronage situation, and nothing has changed. We're leaving that situation exactly the way it is. You know, we really asked for one procedural change, which we wanted so much, which would help this House function, and that was to eliminate proxy voting. And you know, I know we're all stretched thin, and we have difficulty making all these subcommittee meetings. But the truth of the matter is the American people are entitled to have their member of Congress casting their personal vote in person on all of these major issues that regulate their lives and that affect business and industry in this country. And yet we are denied all of that. What's going to come to the floor, ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow is going to be this bill, and ironically and pathetically, in the name of congressional reform, it's going to come to the floor under a closed rule, a gag rule that is not going to allow David Obey, a Democrat on your side of the aisle, to offer an amendment eliminating proxy voting. It's not going to allow Pat Roberts from Kansas, a member of the House Administration Committee, to offer his amendments, a whole series of amendments that we have here dealing with good government. I had a proposal which we presented, and I was a member of that bipartisan task force that you served on, Mr. Chairman. My friend Charlie Rose out in the audience served on, and others. But it was something that would guarantee that we were going to get some kind of procedural reforms that would help to correct this kind of a problem. This kind of a problem that I'm talking about are restrictive gag rules and waivers of the Budget Act that have led to these tremendous deficits that we are dealing in today. And I could read them all here, but you know, going back to the 95th Congress in 1977 and 78, about the time I came here, restrictive rules that waived budget acts, there were only 15% of all the rules that did that. Then we went to the next year, the 96, during 1979 and 80, and it jumped to 25%. Waiving the rules, waiving restrictive rules, gagging members of Congress. The 1981 and 82, it jumped to 27%. 1983 and 84 to 32%. 1985 and 86, it jumped to 43%. It goes on up, where this year, in this 102nd Congress, 64% of all of the rules that put legislation on this floor waive the Budget Act and restrict members from offering amendments. Now, that's the same kind of thing we're going to be dealing with legislative reform tomorrow. I had proposed to Speaker Foley and to the Democrats, and we Republicans had a proposal to create either this same bipartisan leadership task force made up of the 8 and 8 members, or a new 10-member task force made up of 5 members each, which would look into the problems that are paralyzing this Congress today. We wanted to establish this task force to look into the number of subcommittees and the appropriate committee and subcommittee assignments per member, the committee budgeting and staffing, including the size of staffs that have just grown astronomically, and the equitable minority staffing, the multiple referral of bills to more than one committee, sequential referrals that absolutely paralyze this Congress, proxy voting and 1/3 quorums in committees that allow this Congress to function with maybe 7 Republicans on this side and 1 Democrat, and yet they can waive all these proxies and change the lives of people. And it goes on, but we were going to limit it to just that memory. All I wanted to do was to have this committee report back by September 30th on how these problems affect this Congress and the American people, and report back to our respective caucuses, your Democrat caucus and our Republican caucus, so that we could then try to do something by the beginning of next year, the new sitting Congress, to try to reform this House, and we were just shot down summarily. And that's why we are so upset, because you know, I had almost decided not to run again for Congress this year, and maybe some people might like that, but you know, it's just so frustrating because the Congress is so unfair. And I'm going to run again, because we're going to try, even after this legislation passes and does nothing, we still are going to do all we can to try to reform this House for the coming year. And that's why I'm going to offer an open amendment so that we can put this issue out on the floor. We don't need to go rushing home for 2 weeks and brush all this aside. We could spend 2 or 3 days debating this issue on the floor and let the American people see what's wrong with Congress. But instead of that, I'm just afraid this committee, this all-powerful committee, is going to gag your members and not let us vote on these terribly important issues. So I'm sorry to have taken up so much of the members' time, but just want you to know how I feel about it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, you must admit that when you talked about legislative reforms, the Speaker said he would address them at the beginning of next year.
He did, Joe, and I respect that. As a matter of fact, I'm one of those co-sponsors of the Hamilton-Gradison task force. He also, at your insistence, has placed the Hamilton-Gradison for hearing, and also your own line item veto. It'll be before the subcommittee. Right, and the issue of the motions to recommit with instructions. Right. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate all that, but you know, Hamilton-Gradison is a committee that's going to be set up to look into all the all-encompassing issues that are facing us here. That committee is going to meet for a year. Now, it isn't going to take effect until the first of the year, and that means it's going to be a year into the next Congress before anything is done. And I recall talking with my friend Tony Bielenson about the first committee I served on when I came to the Congress in 1979. The Congress had set up a committee on committees to study what was wrong with the Congress at that time, which still continues to be that problem. The chairman of that committee was Jerry Patterson, a good Democrat from California, and he and we put together a package of reform which severely reduced all these committees and subcommittees and select committees, and we really got into diminishing all of these fiefdoms of all of these subcommittee chairmen and ranking members, and we took this package and we were in full agreement. All Republicans and all Democrats, we took it to the floor of the House, and what do you think happened? There are 435 members of Congress. We got less than 10% of them to vote for this reform. You know what's going to happen a year and a half from now with Hamilton-Gradison? The same thing, because a year and a half from now, the post office thing will be behind us, the House Bank thing will be behind us, and the same kind of arrogance will still continue to exist. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your cooperation and your help, but again, I'm just afraid that nothing's going to come of it, and we're going to end up right where we're back, and I'm going to be embarrassed to be a member of this body.
Well, I think we should turn it over to the man who's probably spent more time looking at it, and maybe he can iron out some of the differences you and I seem to have. The Honorable Chairman Charlie Rose.
Mr. Chairman, it's an honor to be before your committee today. Thank you for the opportunity to address your committee. Let me say right off, the members of this, the membership of the House knows the purpose of this resolution. This resolution would create a House administrator and an auditor to ensure the integrity of the service operations of the House. It's been the subject of intensive negotiations between the majority and the minority party and their negotiating delegations, Mr. Solomon just referred to. Dave Obey, the Speaker, the Majority Leader, the Whip, have personally explained the bill to nearly the entire Democratic membership. Republicans have had several meetings on their conference on the subject. I don't think a single Democratic or Republican member remains uninformed by their respective leaderships. I point this out because I'm seeking a rule providing for 1 hour of general debate on the resolution and a suitable resolution to ensure that the minority has an opportunity to address their specific concerns. I believe this is a reasonable way to proceed in light of the difficulties which the negotiations faced, particularly the time deadlines. I thank each of you for your patience, and I'm prepared to answer any questions.
Mr. Bielenson?
No real questions, Mr. Chairman. Just one brief comment to our friend from New York, Mr. Solomon, just to reassure him, as the chairman already has, that there are a lot of us around here from both parties who care deeply about reform and mean to keep pushing for reform, however each of us defines it, you know, throughout this year and next year and the year after. It all can't be done at once. We are responding quickly, I think, and pretty well, not wonderfully well, to some immediate problems which have to be dealt with. Our friends in the other party, the minority party, bring up some matters which many of us in the majority also agree with, but also feel, I think correctly, although I don't want to argue the matter now, don't really feel fall within the jurisdiction of the immediate problems that we're trying to respond to here. And I'm only trying to say to the gentleman, I think that what Mr. Rose and his people are proposing are very real, do solve some very real and immediate problems, do start cleaning up some portions of the administration of this place in a way that not only the public but the vast majority of members will approve. And what's important is for good chaps on your side, like yourself, Mr. Solomon, Mr. Thomas, who's been useful, especially useful recently, as we discussed earlier, with respect to franking privileges and their overextension, to keep after us over the next half year or year or so, to make sure that this Gradis and Hamilton thing works out, to make sure that we keep having hearings on the things that the gentleman from New York proposes. I suspect we're all going to be feel relatively good when we look back a year or so from now at the way that we have dealt with or tried to deal with problems around here. They can't all be done immediately right now. But this particular problem is just referred to, which the chairman in his, I thought, very, very good opening remarks referred to, ought to be dealt with now, is going to be dealt with now. I just think we have to keep the pressure on to ensure that we deal with other things that we are all aware of later as the session goes on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to ask any questions. I just want to tell my friend Charlie Rose, who wears two hats. He's also the president of the North Atlantic Assembly, which is the political arm of the NATO alliance, and who I've had the privilege of working with for more than 10 years on that body. That we have great respect for him, and I understand where he's coming from. He does a good job in his position, along with Bill Thomas, his counterpart, and my criticism of this legislation has nothing to do with his effort or Bill Thomas's, who really do try to do a good job for us, I think. I just wanted to know that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Frost, Mr. Quillen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to congratulate Mr. Rose and others on the committee for their action, but I would like to ask a question. Who names the administrator?
The administrator under this proposal would be named by the Speaker and the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader. In other words, they would each have to agree. They would have to come to a meeting of the minds. The Minority Leader could veto a suggested person, the Majority Leader, the Speaker, could veto it. They all three have to agree. And that, I think, is tantamount to a pretty substantial protection for the minority.
Is there any limited number of names that would have to be submitted before that's cut off? That can go on
I would hope they would not, hope they'd pre-test the waters, because they could go on forever, technically. But I think they don't want that to happen because they want an administrator.
So even though the Speaker and Majority Leader on one side and the Minority Leaders on the other side, right, it's equal because either one can veto.
Well, in the sense that anyone, including the minority, can veto it, yeah. Yes, the minority is fully protected.
In other words, it's not like the Rules Committee. 9 Democrats and 4 Republicans. I
don't know how you all do your business up here, but I hear from you occasionally and see you on C-SPAN. And as far as I can tell, you do a good job.
Thank you, Charlie. I tell you, there's no crisis facing the credibility of the Congress and what's happened here in the last few months. We must do something to turn it around. Too many members, good members, are retiring. Others are fearful in their campaigns that what's happened in the House bank check hiding will affect their re-election. But we all know that we've got to do something, and we should do it right away. And maybe bringing this to the floor tomorrow is a good omen, but we're going to bring it to the floor without amendments, and I don't know whether that's good or not. Everybody has a different idea, including this member maybe, but if we can make it gel, if we can make it work, if we can turn things around, I think that's what we must do.
Gentleman Neal,
be glad to.
Gentleman's aware there's going to be a substitute to this.
Yes, I am aware that there'll be a substitute, but on the other hand, there are several amendments that members would like to offer. And
all right, I wasn't sure you were aware.
Yes, I am. That's all, Mr. Chairman. I know the hour's getting late, and we got to.
Mr. Frost, Mr. Hall.
No questions right now.
Mr. Dreyer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The thing that concerns me about this, Charlie, is that, as I think Tony said and Chairman Moakley has said, we want to get on to dealing with the problems that the American people are facing. And you raised that, Mr. Chairman, and I think you're absolutely right. But as we look at this issue, there is now a great deal of attention on it. And I think Jerry was alluding to the fact that if we go off into the next year, that we'll see many of these problems behind us, and we won't focus on the kind of reform that the American people are calling for today. Now, there are a wide range of amendments that have been proposed. I know Mr. Thomas wants to make the administration committee clearly bipartisan. We have 4 amendments look very good to be offered by our friend from Iowa, Mr. Nussel. Privatization of House services, something that Mr. Roberts wants to do, and he's talked about that there. As I look down this list, it seems to me rather tragic that we can't have an opportunity to get at this and to explain to you, because you seem to think that everything works fine up here in the Rules Committee. The way it works, Charlie, is that with a 9-4 vote, it'll be impossible for us to get the amendments which our minority members would like to offer down to the floor. And I think that as we look at this, these kinds of issues are now of interest to the American people, I mean, who are closely scrutinizing this institution. And like everyone here, I have a great deal of pride in this place. It's the greatest deliberative body known to man. I think we should do everything we can to improve it. And I congratulate you for the steps that you're taking, but I think that we really need to go further. And frankly, I hope that Jerry Solomon is dead wrong. I hope this institution is under much different management come January. In fact, with all due respect to Chairman Moakley, I hope Jerry's sitting where he is next year. And there are some people who think that things wouldn't change much, but I have a sneaking suspicion that they just might. And I hope we can go further and allow some of these amendments to be, frankly, all these amendments that minority members would offer. And our first attempt is going to be to offer an open rule so that members who want to take the concerns that their constituents have raised. I mean, with the advent of C-SPAN covering the activities on the House floor and all the media attention on this, there are many people out there who have some great ideas as to how we might reform this place, and they've come forward to members. And I just think every member here should have an opportunity to offer those, and I hope we'll be able to. Thanks, Chairman.
Any other questions of Mr. Rose? Charlie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Honorable Pat Roberts.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I'm going to save my reform speech for the floor of the House and deal specifically with the amendment that I would like to have you make in order. It occurs to me if we continue this discussion on such major matters, we could all be eligible for the earnings limitation test if we do not expedite this, and so I will try to do that. I am also the Vice Chairman of the Post Office investigation, which is ongoing at this moment, and would like to return to that as fast as possible. We're going to consider the Congressional Reform package as outlined by my Chairman of the House Administration Committee, but I think one fundamental question must be considered. Why is the House involved in creating and running many operations and services on Capitol Hill that can be easily contracted out to private vendors and also those operators? My amendment would simply instruct the House and instruct the Speaker to eliminate the need for 1,015 House employees at a savings of $25.8 million a year. It simply directs the Speaker to do what he has already said what he wants to do, and that is in the patronage system, to take action by the end of the 102nd Congress to complete the contracting for these services and eliminate more than 1,000 staff positions. The services I have identified include the house restaurant, the house barbershop, the house beauty shop, office supply, the photography office, the folding room, and more. I have a list of the functions of these particular services. I have a list of the salary and the cost per year, and I have a list of the positions. I have the personnel list in regard to who now occupies these positions, and also the cost. Although my legislation is in the form of a House resolution, at this point it would be my intention to have it offered as an amendment to the resolution to the committee as of today, and to speak to that on the House floor as of tomorrow. I would hope the committee would look favorably on my proposal. I would be happy to try and answer any questions anybody simply might have.
Any questions of Mr. Roberts?
One very quick one.
Mr. Bielenson.
Because the gentleman is one of my favorite members from the other party. Was your proposal, I mean, very briefly, Pat, is your proposal that we would basically eliminate these positions or these functions unless we wanted to pay for them through providing them through private providers? I mean, so you sort of have to look at them all over again and decide this is something that's essential, necessary, and therefore we ought to contract for it?
As we go through this business of reform, yeah, it seems to me that part of the problem has been the patronage system, right, and I say that in a bipartisan way. We are seeing that in regards to the various investigations that have been ongoing. It's a pretty sordid tale of woe in regards to professionalism. And so consequently, there are certain House functions that if we would simply privatize it, we really don't have any business in it, except we've been doing that. Mr. Moakley is most familiar with what I'm talking about, as I am, because I was his counterpart, am his counterpart in regards to patronage. Why on earth should the House be in the business of the House restaurant system? And it's my understanding eventually, once we get that straightened out, that we will go back to an individual contractor. For the House Post Office, we can have the Postal Service do it. The House Recording Studio, Office Supply, the Furnishings Office, the Photography Office, the Barber Shop, and the Beauty Shop. We used to do this in the past to some degree in regard to simply having bids, accepting the lowest bids, and then your chief financial officer or your administrative officer could keep track. Right. And we don't have the business of having 1,015 employees under patronage that, quite frankly, in many cases are not qualified to do the job, okay, and become an embarrassment to the membership. Okay,
just so I understand you, and then I'll quit, Mr. Chairman. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we would save an awful lot of money, nor are you saying that's necessarily true. We might rehire through the private sector,
without question,
people to serve these particular functions.
Yes, without question, there would be a cost involved, but there would be a savings in that the contractor would pay, obviously, some kind of a rental agreement, but in most cases you simply don't have the patronage system as an albatross around the neck of this Congress. Speaker's indicated it's on its way out anyway. It has already been on its way out in regards to the post office situation. That's only 10% of it. We might as well go ahead and give the Speaker the ability to move forward in this.
Well, you would ensure, one would hope that these various functions would be performed at least adequately and professionally, but I suppose it's not necessarily true that we'd save money. It may be that we have to spend even a little bit more money to have private people do a decent job at these particular functions.
I doubt that's the case if you look at the amount of salaries and the positions and okay, who's where and who's doing the work and who's not doing the work.
Fair enough.
I'm not going to get into that because we'll make that recommendation for the post office on down the road.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, Pat, you know, you're right on the button, and I don't think there's any question about what it would save money in the long run, especially I yield to the gentleman from California who's going to make a motion on your behalf. My mic's out of order.
Let me just say that the concept of privatization is one which is very, very important. I look at Bob Walker sitting here on the front row, and I remember when I first came to this Congress in 1981, the discussion of Circular A76 was a very, very important one that dealt with the whole issue of letting out to the private sector whenever possible. It seems to me that in this institution, we should do everything that we possibly can to set an example there. One of the things that people are talking about is the economic challenges, and we had discussion earlier about the job market. It seems to me that we could help encourage the small business sector of the economy and a wide range of other areas if we were to move towards some semblance of privatization. And that competition which would be created by it would clearly provide better service to the people here in this institution, and I congratulate my friend for offering this. I'm going to tell him that when we proceed to marking up this rule that I will be offering his amendment here.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his comments, and just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, we had a big fuss up in the House Administration Committee in regards to the daycare center that is run by the House. That's at a cost of $394,000, $737, and we have 18 positions. And we really got into a rather philosophical argument here as to whether the House should be running its own daycare center or whether we could privatize it, and we had ample evidence that in regards of cost, if we would privatize it, it would be considerably less. Now, I'm not trying to say who is right and wrong in this respect, but as it works out, I think we could have done a lot better job in terms of a private outfit simply doing this. We would have avoided a lot of the problems with patronage and favoritism and all of that that seems to
Pat, as you look at that,
all the time.
As you look at that figure there, do you have any? Did you all do any projection as to what it might cost if we were to let that out?
Well, they were considerably less. I'm not going to get tied down to a specific figure because I'd have to do my homework on it. But let me just mention another one with a barbershop of $160,737, 7 positions. There used to be 4 barbershops on the House side. Now they're down to 1. And on the House Administration Committee, we get into this debate every year. What's the acceptable price for a haircut? Obviously, in my case, it isn't very much. But I would tell the gentleman we've gone from $6 to $8 to $10 to $12, and how many people would be there, and whose favorite barber would still be there, whose patronage is that favorite barber. What on earth are we doing this for? Contracted out. 2 individual barbers down there now would like the contract. We could have it on bid. They run it. We don't have to worry about patronage. We don't have to be in the business of voting on what the price of a haircut should be. Absolutely ridiculous. We can go all the way down here in terms of these functions, and every one of them we can do this. We shouldn't be in the business of politicizing with patronage jobs essential functions of the House that shouldn't be political.
I think it's a good amendment, and I'll look forward to offering it.
That's exactly the thrust of the proposal, to get qualified people in there. I think you've indicated that some of those people aren't qualified. Now, I didn't know the barbers were under patronage. Are the barbers under patronage?
Well, we have barbers who may not officially be under patronage, but they are listed under personnel, and I can assure you that if there's any kind of a policy change in regards to the price of a haircut or whose chair operates where, what wall goes up in between what barber, I hear from quite a few people who whisper to me in short, jerky sentences with adjectives and adverbs I can't repeat, why are you treating, quote, my barber the way you are, you are really treating him. I have to treat mine, of course, with special, with special fare. But you're exactly right. We shouldn't be in this business. All I'm trying to do is have an amendment that says to the Speaker, go ahead, ride this horse. Get rid of the patronage system. Cease the embarrassment. Cease the embarrassment. There's quite a bit of foreign matter that comes in a pasture in Kansas that is under % of it in the post office, and we will come up with a management plan that I am confident on a bipartisan basis, 3 and 3, that hopefully will take care of that. Since we're taking that step, let's go ahead and let's get the members out of the business of patronage so we have a professional in there that knows what they're doing as opposed to who their sponsor is, who they know, et cetera, et cetera. It's embarrassing. We ought to put this behind us. Then we could get to the gentleman's basic concern and all of our concern. Let's get to the deficit. Let's get to health care. Let's get to the issues that are really affecting the country. This has produced gridlock. We do not need it. We do not have time for it. We should not be in the patronage business. And by the way, whether it were Republican or Democrat, there are two positions at the patronage office that are paid over $100,000, and we don't need that. And it isn't that all of these people are going to be turned out on the street. If they are professionally qualified, why, certainly the contractor could take that into consideration, and we can recommend that. We're doing that with the post office right now.
Pat, wouldn't the Director of Non-Legislative and Financial Services be the one that would then choose these people?
Well, I would much prefer the leader's bill where we have a chief financial officer, and that financial officer would not get into policy matters,
right.
and that the financial officer would also, in keeping with the leader's bill and another amendment I would have liked to introduce, to have the full auditing in public, so we get in terms of the money, we can, you know, you get into the full public disclosure. But if that chief financial officer...
Why didn't you introduce that amendment?
Pardon me?
Why didn't you introduce that amendment?
Well, we're thinking about it. We're going to get it, you know, that's
well, let me know
yet another chapter. But if we had a chief financial officer, or the type of officer that you describe in regards to your bill, or the bill that the majority will have on the floor, and if we had public disclosure of where the money is coming from and where it's going, i.e. the contingency funds and the reprogramming of funds or whatever, we'd clean this house in a minute. Absolutely clean it up. You wouldn't have to worry about it. I, in my position, when we go through all of the clerk's requests and the doorkeeper's requests and the postmaster's requests and the sergeant-at-arms request, and you know full well what we've been doing in the past, when we find enough people to finally do the work because others didn't do the work, and then we put that package before the House Administration Committee and we say we're going to spend this amount of money with this slots, and then there's a little line that says, well, now the minority is entitled to what we have agreed to. And that is because I have tried to whisper sweet nothings in your ear, and you've been very reasonable, and now Mr. Brooks, despite his short cigar, is somewhat reasonable, and you know, you all get 158 down at the post office and we get 2. Thank God we only have 2 under the circumstances that we have it in now. We don't need to be doing that. Just don't need to be doing it.
But the happiest day in my life is when I was relieved from that position and Jack Brooks picked it up.
I am still sentenced to that position, which is why I'm introducing this amendment.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, I believe we bypassed the meeting.
I'm sorry, Jack. It's unintentional.
Pat, I want to congratulate you. You're very good with words. And with words, I think your amendment makes sense. I'm glad it will be offered here in the committee, and I shall vote for it. Thank you.
I thank my colleague and friend.
Tony? Richard, you've spoken already. Pat, thank you very much.
Could I,
thank you.
Could I ask one thing, Chairman? And perhaps, Pat, you're not the correct person to ask this to, and I'm really not sure who is. Maybe it's Mr. Thomas. The substitute that Mr. Michael wants us to make in order, and I don't know who speaks for the subcommittee on this in favor of the substitute.
It would be Mr. Thomas, but I will do my best, Mr. Frost.
Appears to have everything in the kitchen sink in it. It does not appear to me to be and I don't mean to be harsh in this, it does not appear to be a serious proposal in that it's got so many things in it.
Well, the kitchen sink is pretty dirty, I would tell myself.
It's got so many things in it that it is not a practical proposal at this point, because it's not something that the House would likely to be able to give serious consideration to, because there's so much in it, and there's so many, it covers so many different subjects. It doesn't seem to be appropriately narrow to really deal with the problems at hand. It just seems like a wish list of everything that the Republicans that y'all have wanted on your side for as long as I can remember in Congress.
That's the problem,
on a whole range of subjects, not just on the immediate issue at hand. I just raised
okay, let me respond if I might, and I'm not speaking for the leader, I'm not speaking for the Republican position, I'm not on the task force, but as a person who has been long concerned and very frustrated over the need for reform. I think what has happened is this. In this particular case, I saw an opening to do what I thought would relieve the House of a very unnecessary burden and a real embarrassment at less cost. And it made sense to me. It made sense to get us out of this business of these functions that could be provided by a private contractor. What on earth is partisan about the barbershop or the beauty shop, or whatever? I can't understand why we can't do that. So that was my effort. Now, everybody on our side has a feeling that who we are and what we are is what you allow us to be. Now, sometimes that happens in the sometimes powerful House Agriculture Committee. We're a family. And so Republicans can play a role, but you have a lot of frustrated people, obviously people who serve on the Rules Committee because of the makeup, not because of the personality of the chairman, that you're always on the short end. And so when you have a Republican effort and you're going to talk about reform, everybody comes to the party. Now, I'm for public disclosure. I think that's the thing. I think old sunshine is the horse that we ride, and I think if you have sunshine, you're going to prevent things like the 3-story underground visitor center or the marble floors in the elevators and all the rest of the things that have been in the press. So if I could, I would like to combine the public disclosure in this regard, but with the House Financial Officer in the leader's bill and with the administrator, or whatever you want to call him, in your bill, why, hopefully we could get that done. And you're right, it is a wish list. It is a wish on the part of the Republican minority that we step out of this business of being partisan, and we at least are considered in how this place runs. I would like to separate the administrative functions from the legislative functions, because I think they're two separate things. But I can tell you, when you chafe and chafe and chafe, or when you come to the body and you're brand new and you say, how come we can't do this? And it's, well, that's just the way it is. People get upset. And with public disclosure, we have had with the bank and with the restaurant and with the post office some very serious things that are wrong. And the system is broke, and we have to fix it. One of the ways we fix it, it seems to me, is with public disclosure and to press ahead. Now, our laundry list is long, but our grievances are long. I don't know if that helps the gentleman. I think I'm making a speech that I said that I wouldn't make.
Would the gentleman yield before he goes in concern in regard to what the gentleman just said about the so-called Michael proposal? Let me just preface my remarks on that by saying I just talked to the Congressional Research Service just 10 minutes ago, and they tell me, and these are their figures, so it's not me making them up, that it costs to run the Congress. Now that's the House of Representatives and the Senate and all of the affiliate agencies, $3.1 billion annually. Now that's $3,000 million. $3,000 million divided by 535 of us. I think that comes in, just a fast calculation, to something over $5 million apiece for us to represent our 580,000 constituents back home. But getting to my friend from Texas, Mr. Frost's statement that he thought that Bob Michael's proposal was not reasonable. All Bob Michael has done is take a bill we couldn't see, which we only got at the beginning of this hearing, which started about an hour ago, which only deals in concepts. And all Mr. Michael has done, page after page here, when it deals with the House administration, is fill in the gaps and put teeth in the legislation. On the Inspector General, he put teeth into it. On the Council, he put teeth into it. On the, and it goes right down the line. So it's not very complicated at all.
May reclaim my time for my good friend.
Sure you may.
The laundry list appears to include a number of legislative matters, not administrative matters, which it is contemplated would be discussed by the Hamilton-Gradison Task Force. That's the only point that I was making, that it appears to be combining so much into one proposal that it really doesn't go to the administration of the House, to the things that we are currently trying to resolve. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
Well, and the reason that Mr. Michael had to go into depth on the legislative matter is because you just arbitrarily denied the Solomon Task Force, which was going to report on this within 4 months and make some meaningful changes on a priority basis. And we were just rejected out of hand. So that's the reason for it. Too bad.
Well, the gentleman from New York knows well that any changes he may make in the rules now would be up for another look in January. So, I mean, whatever changes you made would probably last about 2 or 3 months.
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly what we're worried about, and if you'll be good enough to yield, there's a picture on the wall. Is that Dick Bowling's picture over there?
Yeah.
Well, you know, Dick Bowling, back in 1974, tried to put together, with our good friend who will be testifying before us later, Mr. Dave Obey, put through reforms, and he rammed them through this Congress and made them effective in that year, so that the new sitting Congress would have had to repeal those. Now, you don't tell me, with 120 new members, possibly, maybe 150 coming in here, that they're going to repeal legislative reform that's good for the American people? No siree, they're not. That's why we wanted to do it now rather than wait until January 3rd.
Could I respond to that point?
I'd be glad to yield the gentleman.
With projections of 120, 150, and Lord knows what in terms of new members, the laundry list will get larger, because the perception is that the laundry is very dirty and we have a tub full. And I would tell the gentleman, as a veteran, having been sentenced to the House Administration Committee, And having worked with this for 8 to 10 years, we better take care of it now with some degree of expertise, or we will have a continuation of what we have had with the bank, the restaurant, and now the post office, and we will be reacting in a very reactionary way that we could do some very severe damage to the institution. Not that we don't need reform, but we better move, or Lord knows what's going to happen in the next session of the Congress.
Thank you, John.
Any questions? Thank you very much, Pat. The Honorable David Obey of Wisconsin. Bill, I'm sorry I missed you. I didn't. The names were reversed on my sheet, so it wasn't intentional.
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, he agreed to it. Oh.
Mr. Chairman, before I was elected to Congress, my family ran a restaurant in my hometown. And I worked in that restaurant. And if I had wanted to continue worrying about restaurants or barber shops or carpenter shops, I would never run for Congress in the first place. I would have continued to stay home and deal with the family restaurant. I don't think that's what we came here to do. I think we came here to try to deal with legislation that affects the lives of our constituents, whether it's unemployment compensation or health care or education, you name it. I don't think we intended to be assigned to the KP detail or the garbage detail. And frankly, I think it's important, having chewed this rag now for a long time, that we simply do it, get it done, get it behind us, and get back to the problems that the American people want us to wrestle with. I am here because this is the second time I've been through this. As the chair knows, in 1975, I was appointed by the Speaker to chair a task force to produce a new code of ethics for the House. And we did that. And it was adopted on a bipartisan basis. And then we had a second job to do in our task force, which was to produce a set of administrative reforms. And the administrative reforms which we produced were not just put together by members of Congress. They were put together by a commission composed of members of Congress and outside public members, including people like Bill Duchesne, who was head of the textile workers, Roscoe Egger, who later became Ronald Reagan's IRS commissioner, Bob Galvin from Motorola Corporation, Lucy Benson, who was the head of the League of Women Voters, Chuck Daly, who now heads the Kennedy Library, scholars like Ralph Hewitt, a well-known congressional scholar, Bill Hamilton, the pollster. Before we did anything, we ran a poll to discover what the public wanted out of this place and how they wanted us to operate. Then we produced a set of recommendations that tried to reflect that. And when those recommendations were brought to the floor, they were shot down. They would have created, sound familiar, a House administrator. They would have created a House auditor. They would have set up a number of other reform techniques. They would have required that the House administrator set no discount market rate prices for any services around here. And I would submit that if those reforms had been passed, that I doubt very much that we would be here today being embarrassed about the House bank situation or being angry about what has happened in the post office, because I submit that a professional manager who understood and who dealt every day with business-like normal management practices would have understood that a lot of the practices that are left over from another era in this place simply do the place no favors. They do members no real favors. All they do is get the institution in trouble. And I find it very interesting that after all of the discussion, that while there are some minor changes around the edges, that the proposal which is before you today is give or take 15 years, which is how long it's been since they were defeated, it's very similar to the proposals that we raised in those years. I think this package is a fine package. This package is meant to deal with administrative reforms in the House. It is not meant to deal with other questions such as what the committee structure of the Congress ought to be, or what the power arrangements ought to be between political parties. Public isn't interested in that right now. The public wants to know that if we do, public really wants us to get off this and get back to their business rather than ours, first of all. But secondly, they want to know that whatever we do here is going to guarantee that we have a system of financial arrangements which can pass muster, so that the institution is embarrassed again. I agree with the gentleman from Kansas. I think there ought not to be a dime's worth of patronage in this place. I think patronage is a pain in the you-know-what, and I think it ought to be scuttled. I think this House Administrator ought to take a look at it and ought to recommend to the committee that it be gone, and I think it ought to be gone, and I think it will be. But what I ask you not to allow a repeat of what happened in 1977. I wrote a newsletter to every one of my constituents laying out what happened when our reform package went down in 1977. And I pointed out some of the anomalies around here. We had one support office responsible for floor coverings, another takes care of wall coverings. One office bought and installed curtains, but another hung Venetian blinds. One office serviced outside door locks, another took care of inside door locks. One serviced, came to your office if you needed to change incandescent lamps, another one came if you needed to change fluorescent lamps. Still do. And those are the kind of chicken blank questions that members of Congress shouldn't be wrestling with, and that's why we need I think that's why we need an administrator for support services, and we need a inspector general or auditor or whatever moniker you want to put on him, who will make sure that the financial affairs of those operations are kosher. Now, in this newsletter at the time, I pointed out most of the reasons for the defeat of the package, but I believe today that there were three main reasons. Number one, and the vote was we had 161 Democrats who voted for the package and 113 Democrats who voted against it. And then we had Republicans who voted against it, 139-0. And when you took a look at the reasons on both sides, what you found was this: Republicans voted against it because they said they didn't like the terms under which the reforms were going to be discussed, debated. They wanted a different rule. There were also an awful lot of them who really didn't want kind of reform. You had a lot of Republicans and a lot of Democrats who wanted to publicly post their political holy pictures embracing reform publicly, while behind the scenes they really didn't want it. And on our side of the aisle, I think you had some people who were set in their ways, used to be able to dealing with things the way they wanted them, and they didn't want any change in their comfortable arrangements. And I also think that we had a reaction against the ethics package. And members said, we passed the new ethics package, we're not getting any credit, to hell with it, take your reforms, stick them in your ear, we don't want any more of them. So it was brought down. But one of the underlying fights at the time between the majority and the minority was whether we were going to deal with this as a financial issue or whether we were going to deal with this as an internal power issue. I'd suggest to you that those are both legitimate questions, but not both to be dealt with at this time. Our obligation now is to make certain that the financial arrangements are correct and the administrative arrangements are correct. And then I think we need to move on and do what we are going to do with the Hamilton Committee. And we need to set that committee up to take a look at the long-term institutional questions that need to be dealt with. Example, proxy voting. I happen to agree with the Republican Party. I think proxy voting is crazy. But I don't think you can get rid of proxy voting unless you have a significant change in the committee structure of the House. Because if you do, with the continuing number of committee assignments that people have, people are going to be so strung out you'll never have a quorum anywhere, and you won't be able to do any of the public's business. And so it seems to me those are all legitimate questions. But they ought not to intrude on this bill, because this bill is dealing with an urgent financial problem that can and needs to be corrected tomorrow. So I would simply ask you, please do not let individual members with individual ideas allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. I don't know if this is the best way to wire together this package. Lots of things I would change if I could wave a magic wand, but I think this represents a very responsible package. It's a very tough package, and it provides for bipartisan responsibility for the selection of these two key people. I think that's the way it ought to be, and I hope this does not degenerate into another argument about political power rather than institutional financial correctness, as it did back in 1977.
As usual, Dave, you were right on the money, and I know how active you were in the task force and talking about some of these past attempts at reform you made when it was way out of style. You were just too far ahead of your time. Mr. Bielenson.
Nothing other than just to echo what the chairman said. David, that was extremely good testimony. Thank you very much. And I think anybody who's listening understands exactly what you're saying, that these are fundamental, basic, and necessary reforms. They don't cover the whole waterfront. They don't deal with some of the legislative matters, right, you know, that our friends on the other side, rightly or wrongly, believe ought to be dealt with. But you cannot do absolutely everything in one bill. This does take care of the problems which are immediately before us in a way which makes me feel good, because someone like yourself is supportive of, you're the person many of us look to when it comes to this sort of thing.
I mean, the danger is always, whenever, and face it, I know what some people are saying to me, and I've had people in both parties come to me today and say, my God, why are we doing this? And I tell you what's in at least some of their minds. What's in some of their minds, be they Republican or Democrat, is that what they would really like to see is, they'd like to see this baby so loaded up with everything but the kitchen sink that it falls of its own weight. That's really what my package did. If I made any mistake, the major mistake that I made in '77 was to put the institutional financial reforms together with the resurrection of the bowling committee reforms, which would have gotten a number of the things I think these gentlemen are interested in. And the combination of those two loaded it up so much that you couldn't get either done. That was my mistake, and I take full responsibility. That's what the Michael Amendment, I think, would do again in large measure.
And actually, we were told earlier that that amendment does include the kitchen sink.
And, well, I guess that's true. But I just urge you to do this one step at a time, and that's the way you get it done, rather than having another 15-year mea culpa for not getting it done right the first time.
Thank you. Mr. Solomon.
David, you were an invaluable member of the bipartisan task force, and something you always tell it like it is, and I for one appreciate that, even though I may not agree with you on times when you do it. But you just said something which bothers me so much, because you were right. Back in your proposal, back in 1977, you did have a major proposal in your package which would have created a select committee to work on legislative reform. And you just said that that was one of the reasons, the major reasons, why it was summarily defeated. You know, that doesn't speak well for this House and for the members. You know, that we just avoid responsibility. But you're right. I mean, that's exactly what happened. No, if I can amend that. Yield to you. I'm not suggesting that we not do both. I'm suggesting we simply do them in two separate packages, because you can pass both of them freestanding. You cannot pass them combining them. And I think you know that as well as I do. Well, I know it, David, and you know, I wish you were a member of this Rules Committee, because, you know, in our bipartisan task force, you spoke out, you supported prohibiting proxy voting, and I admire you for that. And but not in this package. No, not in this other package. Well, that's the point I'm getting to. And you supported eliminating patronage a few minutes ago, so supporting Pat Roberts, and we've got the amendment to do that. but you say not in this package, and that's the whole problem around here. It's never the right time. It's never the right time to talk about line item veto. It's never the right time to talk about balanced budget. It's just never the right time. And that's why we're so concerned, because it ain't ever going to be the right time to talk about legislative reform.
Yes, it will.
A year and a half from now, we're still going to be not the right time. I yield.
Thoughts, Mr. Hall, Mr. Gordon.
Well, let me just add my thanks to David for his thoughtful presentation on this important subject. I have been saying for months that it's important to move forward on these kind of projects. Not that we're going to get any accolades from the public, not that the public is going to have a parade for us, but because we need to make some changes so the process works better. And when the process works better, then the public is going to be more appreciative. And quite frankly, folks like myself and you are going to feel more like it's worth the efforts that we put into this. There's no need of beating your head up against the wall when you can't get legislation through here, because that's the reason we came here. We came to legislate, not to be a clerk. And I think you've gotten this process going. I thank you for your history on it. And I think we're off to hopefully a good start on making some real progress now.
Mr. Quillen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dave, if this question has been answered, I didn't hear it. But what salary will the administrator make? And
I don't remember the exact salary. I think the salary is going to be comparable with House officers.
Well, I mean,
I don't know what House officers are paid, but I know that the intent of the resolution is that the administrator be paid at a comparable level.
Mr. Thomas can probably answer that. He'll be up next.
Do you know what salary the administrator?
Be determined like any professional job, commensurate with his responsibilities and his training and education and background, and the decision will be based upon what qualifications he brings to the job, or she.
All I know is they'll be paid before the end of the month and not after the end of the month, like members of Congress.
Back to Mr. Quillen. Are you through, sir?
No, I don't. Dave, I remember the first reform you brought to the House. And I bitterly objected to the procedure when you limited the earned income for members of Congress. That was the beginning of making the members of the Congress, in my opinion, looked at more closely by the people throughout the country. As I said then, and as I say now, that the Founding Fathers wanted all types of members in the House, successful businessmen, attorneys, and all types. But now, over the years, in my opinion, people who should have been elected to Congress did not run. We're paying the piper now with all that's been happening in the Congress, and I hope this proposal does great things to reinstill confidence in the minds of the people at what we do here. We're at a low ebb, even lower than we were back, when was that, 72?
Well, Jamie, 77. Yeah, it was in 77. Let me simply respond by saying I have a great deal of respect for you, and I think, as you know, a great deal of affection.
I know that.
And
same here, Dave.
I think that your point of view is perfectly legitimate, and I recognize that the reasons you opposed our ethics package back in '76 were perfectly honorable. We just happen to have a difference of agreement. I mean, a difference of opinion. And I'll tell you why I think it was important to limit members' outside income. When we proposed those first limitations on outside income, I had one member who is, thank God, no longer in this place. And he came up to me and he said, Dave, you don't understand. He said, it isn't that I spend any time at my law practice. It's just that as I rise in seniority, the lobby groups toss more action our way and I get a piece of the action. And I said, yeah, I know. That's why we're doing this. And we had a lot of honorable people who earned outside income in honorable ways. But as in any other profession, we had a few jerks. And they soiled the reputation of the entire institution. And so the institution simply felt that it was necessary to limit outside income. We felt the taxpayer would be better, and I believe it deeply today. I think the taxpayer is his interest is far better protected if members of Congress have only one paymaster, the public, rather than being able to supplement their income from a variety of other earned income sources. And I recognize there is a very legitimate difference of opinion on that, but I think history has demonstrated why we had to do that, and I know that those actions cost some people in this place over $100,000 apiece. One of the former chairmen of this committee, it cost him a lot of money, and he with great graciousness accepted it because he said it was necessary for the good of the institution, and I think it was.
Thank you, Mr. Roby.
I don't question that. I think, as it turned out, you probably were right and I was probably wrong. It wasn't a matter of personal income that I lost. I was just in the belief that qualified people in all professions should be members of Congress. There's always a bad apple in every bushel, they say.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, sir. Thank you, Dave Obey, very much.
Thanks.
Mr. Bill Thomas, let me say to my friends and colleagues, we've got 5 more witnesses. We've been here almost exactly 3 hours. Probably even the most dedicated C-SPAN viewer is tiring of this, and some of us have some other things we've got to do too. Without, depriving anyone of time to say whatever he or she desires to, let's maybe keep those things in mind and see if we can't wrap this up in the next short while. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I come before you not as the partisan person I am frequently required to be, given the issues that come before us of a partisan nature. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee. I serve on the Budget Committee. I'm not here because of a need to find a committee to be able to justify my existence. I serve on the House Administration Committee because I'm committed to the institution. I want you to look at me not as someone who argues as best I can on a partisan issue, but as someone who, along with the gentleman from North Carolina before he was chairman and before I was ranking member, oversaw the rewiring of this House in terms of a new telephone system which was akin to rewiring an aircraft carrier at sea with planes taking off and landing and attempting to make the kinds of changes that would get us into the 21st century. Not just pulling optical cable for data connections, not just rethinking the entire computer structure, not just rethinking the way in which historically we financed our district offices with our capital offices and changing that so that we can integrate them, but the day in, day out myriad subjects that the chairman and I face now as he the chairman and I the ranking member in trying to make this institution function. Not in terms of the majority's need to run this as the majority sees fit in those areas that are most appropriate. Because people have seen the chairman and this gentleman from California go toe-to-toe on the floor in the area majority sees fit in those areas that are most appropriate. Because people have seen the chairman and this gentleman from California go toe-to-toe on the floor in the area of campaign finance and in other areas. You've also seen us join arms and put our arms around each other's neck when we had to deal with very difficult institutional problems. I am not here to speak on the minority leader's proposition. I am not on the task force for reform as it's structured. I am here to address myself to one specific section of the majority's plan, of the proposed speaker's plan. I would ask that you look at the first handout that I would give you, which is a single page from the initial resolution that was examined. It is a copy of page 4 of the initial resolution, and I would call your attention to line 18 on page 4. It has to do with the institutional mechanics of the so-called bipartisan reform. It has been mentioned several times that the structure to select this new non-legislative director or the administrator is truly bipartisan. That is, although three individuals have a say, the Speaker, the Majority Leader, and the Minority Leader, any one of the three can object, and therefore someone would not be appointed to the position. That truly is a fair and reasonable bipartisan structure. I address your attention to the ongoing everyday oversight of that administrator. In the resolution that you have in front of you, which is now a historical document, on line 18, it outlines the Oversight Subcommittee. It simply establishes a subcommittee, and it indicates that the chairman of the committee shall be on that subcommittee and the ranking minority members shall be on that subcommittee. Your resolution then was addressed by the Democrat caucus and whatever other groups the Democratic Party thought was appropriate to examine this, and I would offer to you an interim revised version which comes from the April 6th draft, and it's labeled number 2. Has that been passed out? Yes. Number 2 shows you that now we've added several paragraphs. On the top of page 7, it's the Subcommittee on Administrative Oversight. It refers to Clause 3 of Rule 10. It establishes a bipartisan subcommittee on oversight chaired by the chairman. 1/2 of the members of the subcommittee shall be from the majority party, 1/2 shall be from the minority party. That truly is a bipartisan structure. It outlines on line 11, Clause 2, the duties of this subcommittee. But then I would invite your attention to Section 3, line 16. It says, any matter that by reason of a tie vote cannot be resolved by the subcommittee shall be reported to the Committee on House Administration for its consideration. Mr. Chairman, this is a fundamental violation of any attempt to set up a bipartisan oversight of the bipartisan selected non-legislative administrator. The whole purpose of a bipartisan committee is to require interaction between the two parties in even numbers. Decisions ought to be made by a majority. Decisions that cannot be made by a majority should not be moved forward. Bipartisan means equal. What this third clause provides for is that when the Democrats stay as Democrats and Republicans stay as Republicans, the measure is moved to the full partisan committee. It creates the illusion of a bipartisan subcommittee by creating equal numbers and then takes it away by the very mechanics. In no parliamentary law anywhere does a tie advance. A tie loses. You have to have a majority to advance. Now, my friend, and I do call him that, and colleague and fellow laborer in the vineyard, chairman, indicated to you that he was supportive of the structure, and I admire him for coming forward because his Democratic caucus has told him to come forward. I discussed briefly with him while he was here. What I would offer for the record is a letter that the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rose, sent to me outlining the structure of the bipartisan task force for investigation of the post office. It has an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, but it says decisions will be made by a majority of the task force. No gimmicks about moving a tie forward to a partisan structure so that you can appear to be bipartisan, but in fact you are not. It even provides the ability of independent investigation to the minority, which truly means that you have nothing to hide because independently someone else can investigate without asking for permission. Mr. Chairman, I think you would be doing the argument of reform a great disservice if you move to the floor a resolution which says when the Democrats act like Democrats and Republicans act like Republicans, you kick it to a partisan committee which is stacked in your favor. That is not bipartisan reform. I know the pressures that have been required to put that in. I know who forced it into the resolution. They're the very people that Dave Obey talked about who were the ones who sank the last attempt at reform. I do not want to address my leader's suggestions and the depth or scope of his suggestions. I'm operating off of your document. I'm offering only one single suggested change to your document.
It is the single area that I consider to be flawed if you want a bipartisan control of the non-legislative functions. I would invite your attention to the chairman of the House Administrations Committee's suggested and in fact actual structure of the tax force on the post office if you want a true bipartisan reform. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the only reason I have waited all this time to address you in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way. Please don't blow this historic opportunity by bowing to those people who cannot stand the fact that even in non-legislative areas, they don't want to share any power if it's a question of prerogative or a question of compromise or a question of accommodation. Because if it isn't any of those, any structure will work. But it's precisely at the cutting edge of where you've got to come together and work in a bipartisan way that you've got to convince one of the other side to come over to you or you don't go forward. To say that you go forward when there is a tie is to simply create a sham on the whole bipartisan structure, Mr. Chairman, and I would beg you, please, don't include this on the measure that comes to the floor. You've come so close to a true bipartisan structure. You've seen the need for reform. I dealt in this stuff every day trying to correct it. Don't leave me in a situation in which the chairman and I don't have the ability to resolve something in a bipartisan way, but that the partisan pressures dictate that it be kicked up to a partisan decision-making structure. That's wrong. Thank you.
Mr. Derrick.
I have no questions.
Mr. Solomon.
Bill, thank you for that input. And as you know, that was the major thrust behind the Republican proposal, was to leave it at the tie. In other words, if there's a 3-3 committee, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, it would have to be ironed out between them on a bipartisan basis. We even made a further concession that if we could not get that agreement in this legislation that's pending before us, that we at least not send it to the full committee, which is a partisan committee. We made the strong recommendation that instead, if it were issues of pure ministerial operation of the House and not policy matters or political matters such as campaign reform, election reforms, things like that. In other words, that instead of sending it to the full committee where it would receive partisan attention, that we send it to the leadership committee. The leadership committee, as everybody knows, is headed up by the Speaker of the House. It would still be imbalanced because the Democrats would have 4 members on that leadership committee, the Republicans only 3. But the difference would be the Speaker of the House, who is supposed to be a speaker for all of the House and not just one side. Leadership committee is made up of the Speaker of the House. It is made up of the majority leader, a Democrat, and a minority leader, our leader, Bob Michael. It is made up of the whip, in your case, Mr. Bonnier, in our case, Mr. Gingrich, and then the chairman of the full committee and the subcommittee, which is the same thing, Charlie Rose, being a Democrat and you being a Republican. At least on that level, and with the Speaker being the deciding vote on a supposedly impartial basis, since he is supposed to represent the entire House, we would at least have conceded that. And yet that was summarily rejected as well. So that is one of the biggest objections that we have, because, as I stated before, I see nothing in this package that is being presented to us now that is going to prevent another major scandal down the road, whether it's a year from now or 2 years from now. And that's a shame.
If I might briefly respond. Frankly, most of the decisions that we deal with, I would be embarrassed to kick it up to a leadership level in terms of the requirement to make a decision. My only concern is that in my discussions with various members on the other side of the aisle as to why this was done, the very answer as to why it was done was a partisan one, and that was that, well, if we left it the other way, truly bipartisan, we couldn't get any votes. And I would appeal to you folks, even if you can't get any votes for it, It isn't right. Don't use the partisan argument of getting votes. You have a majority here. You can do anything you want. But if you're going to set up a non-legislative structure, if it's truly going to be ministerial, don't rig it in terms of the oversight structure. It will come back to bite you, because the very pressures that forced you to put this in the resolution will be on you every day not to have a Democrat come over. I will have those pressures every day to not have a Republican come over, to make some functionary decision about the running of whatever it is we're supposed to be looking at, and it will be pressured in terms of keep it a tie vote, keep it a tie vote, because then we can roll them in the full committee. I thought that's what we were trying to get away from. And please, don't have the leadership make some decision about a personnel change that the non-legislative administrator is using the task force to counsel on. We have to work together. And I think no one has shown more of a bipartisan administerial ability to work together than the chairman of the committee and myself on those truly ministerial functions. We have committed to ourselves that we would not stalemate, that we would meet as long as it took to work out a problem. We're going forward with some tough decisions, but it works, and it works for the institution. Don't load it up with this Trojan horse. Don't give in to the people who made you change the resolution from the first time to this time. The very forces that made you change it will continue to work to keep a tie vote, to continue to agitate. We will cooperate. We will work equally. We will solve problems. But if you stack the deck, you will get what you've been getting recently, and that is an all-out fight, because it is fundamentally unfair, it is not bipartisan, and it proves that you folks simply are unwilling to share even non-legislative, non-partisan power. And that's what you've been saying you're willing to do. This resolution proves you're not.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Bill, you've been very patient today. As a ranking member on the committee, I was hoping that you could get to testify before you have at this time. You've been here. You've heard the testimony that it was not going to be a partisan setup. And from what you say, it is going to be a partisan setup. Is that correct?
I would tell my friend that I'm not here to argue for what I could consider to be some partisan advantages on our side, given the fact that the Democrats are in a bind, so we try to get as much out of them as we can. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to caution from my long experience in a job that not too many people seem to want, that what has happened to you inside the Democrats' own discussions is that they have lost sight of the one fundamental oversight structure that produces a true shared responsibility in running the non-legislative operations of the House. I don't know what forced them to come to that conclusion. I believe, as I said, it may be the same forces that worked earlier. Maybe it's folks from the partisan committee structure that didn't want this or don't give any concessions to them. I'm saying that if you give any concession, it's got to be the structure of the so-called bipartisan operation to make it bipartisan. So I'm not saying that I'm not addressing myself to the entire package. If I had fundamental problems with other areas in the package, I would address them. I'm not addressing the items that were left out. I don't want to get wrapped up in the problem of going over committee ratios and all the other stuff. That's not my concern. I came here as the guy, along with the chairman, who tries to make this place work. And I think we've done a pretty good job in difficult areas. And I'm telling you that mechanically, that one provision throws a wrench in the whole structure.
Well, Bill, I agree with you, and you do a tremendously good job. And thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Any other questions? Bill, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
We have 4 members out here, and all of them have worked together. All of them have amendments pending before the committee. If it's all right with them, if we could call them up as a panel and give each one of them individually the opportunity to make their statements, and then let us ask questions of each one of them. It would, I personally would like to see it done that way, and so I can ask questions of the 2 members, particularly on that served with you and me on that bipartisan panel. Is there any objection to that?
No objection.
If not...
are you going to testify, Mr. Nelson?
No, sir. You let
Is who going to testify?
No, I didn't know whether he was going to testify.
I thought he asked if you were going to testify.
By seniority, how do we go here? Bob? Yeah, okay. That's right, you're last. Bob, you're senior, I think, aren't you?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, having served on the task force that brought the package that we're considering today, I had really hoped going into that we would take a major step forward toward a fairer and more bipartisan approach to running the House. I think that would have helped us tremendously. I'm afraid, though, having studied the package for the couple of hours that I've been sitting here, that we're a long way from achieving that. In fact, if you go through this proposal, what you really have here is the Administration Committee Power Grab Act of 1992. And if you think that's a healthy thing to do, think for a moment that this is the same committee that for months sat on the post office scandal and didn't move it forward in a timely manner. Only after pressure developed from the outside did they decide to begin to move. And this is where we're going to invest the power. Now, if
you're not talking about this committee here, are you?
No, the House Administration Committee. House Administration Committee. If you go through this proposal, and I'd like to go through this proposal. Just if you look at it on page 4, where does the director of the new director that's being formed? Where does he get his policy direction? Where does he get his oversight? From the House Administration Committee. Pure and simple. He cannot do a thing unless the House Administration Committee allows him to do it. Go to the supposedly independent Officer of Inspector General. Look at where he gets his authority. And you'll find on page 6 that he is subject to the policy direction and oversight of the Committee on House Administration. Pure and simple. He can't do anything unless House Administration tells him he can.
Bob, if I may interrupt, I thought I heard it plain and clear that gentleman could investigate anytime he wants without notifying
No, Mr. Chairman, that's not the proposal. That's not the language. The language says, subject to the policy direction and oversight of the Committee on House Administration, the Inspector General shall be responsible for, and then goes on. He cannot do anything unless House Administration allows him to do it. Then we have the Subcommittee on Administrative Oversight, and the gentleman from California has already pointed out to you how that has been undermined in the bill. If you go, you'll find additional functions that are given to the Committee on House Administration. If you go on then to page 9, you will find that the elimination of perks in the House is given to the Committee on House Administration on direction from the Speaker. If you look at the Office of General Counsel, you will find that the House Administration Committee shall provide for the Office of General Counsel, and then also, interesting language, says, shall ensure appropriate coordination with the minority. Well, in other words, the House Administration Committee, the partisan House Administration Committee, is going to decide what is appropriate in terms of coordination. It's not complete coordination. It's appropriate coordination decided by a partisan body. Throughout this document, it is clear that this is a partisan document that will take us no further than where we have been at the present time. Now, what I would hope to do is add a couple of amendments that I think would at least improve it. Going back again to page 4, one of the things I'm concerned about is, despite what the Speaker said in the task force, that we were going to eliminate all patronage in the House, the fact is that the only patronage that's being eliminated in this document is that under the Director's office. The doorkeeper, the clerk, the sergeant-at-arms, the patronage in those offices will remain in place and will not be touched by this document. I would like to be able to offer an amendment that would cover all the patronage of the House and would include those offices.
Do you have those amendments typed up so we can see them?
I have them written out.
Can we take copies?
Of course, I had to write them while I was here because we hadn't seen a copy of the document. So I'm asking that I be permitted to offer an amendment that would include all the officers of the House under the patronage agreement. That is not what is in the document. I would think that we would want to change under the General Counsel's office the language there that to ensure appropriate coordination to complete coordination. That's what we had agreed to in the task force. There was going to be complete coordination with the minority, and I would like to be able to offer that amendment as well. And I have that one written out here. And it too would follow what the task force said. That is not in the document. And then I would just refer the committee, since you're going to perhaps have a closed rule on this, to the fact that perhaps this bill needs to be tightened up a little bit, because if you'll look at Section 9, you'll find that in Section 9, beginning on page 7, that the chairman of the House Administration Committee is made the chairman of the Oversight Committee, the Bipartisan Oversight Committee. And then if you go to page 8, or I should have started on page 7, I'm sorry. And then you go to page 8, you'll find that something very interesting. The way the process works under the bill that you've drafted, you have this person reporting to himself and then informing himself that he has reported to himself.
Who is that person?
Well, the chairman of the House Administration Committee. The structure that you have set up on page 8 literally has that gentleman, with regard to these matters, reporting to himself and then informing himself that he has reported to himself. Now, my guess is that that's something that probably ought to be cleaned up a little bit before we...
really reporting to a group that consists of larger than himself?
No, because in some of these cases, yeah, but the bottom line is, since he is the chairman throughout, the functional authority of what he does is he reports to himself and then informs himself that he has reported to himself. I would suggest that maybe that's something that you might want to clean up, even if you've decided to have a purely partisan document before the House. One other thing, and I just might mention, I would notice in one of your original drafts that you did give the Inspector General the ability to conduct performance audits of the type that might have saved us from the House Bank scandal. In the document that finally is going forward, that was taken out.
Mr. Livingston.
Mr. Chairman, thank you and all the members for your patience, and I'll try not to belabor this. I was privileged to have been a member of the task force with you, Mr. Chairman, and others in this room, and I was very hopeful that we were going to come up with a truly bipartisan compromise. I really thought at one point that we would. And I think that even though we didn't, we were relatively close. But the fact is that we didn't. And I think a little background, if I can be unlike my friend Bill Thomas, I'll put a partisan hat on. I think a little background is necessary for the record. The fact is that the administration of the House of Representatives in the last 6 months has broken down, maybe in the last year. It's broken down badly. And it's tarnished each and every one of us, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal. Whether you bounced checks or you didn't bounce checks, you were hurt in the last year. Many of us, very innocently, are going to go home to our constituents and not get reelected this next time around if we hold ourselves up for reelection, and many of us are just giving up and not running for reelection. Now, I would submit with my partisan hat on, Mr. Chairman, that that's not the fault of the Republicans, because we didn't have any control over the administration. We didn't have any at all. We had no role in the administration. And now it's broken, we recognize, because it's all come to the forefront with the post office thing and the bank problems. We recognize that it has reached a peak, and something's got to be done. And so we had this bipartisan task force created by the Speaker and the Minority Leader for good purposes, with the intent of putting the thing back together, and hopefully everybody could pitch in and we could just go forward. Well, in my opinion, though, the reason that we didn't reach an agreement was not simply for lack of some good suggestions, and there are some good suggestions. Mr. Walker has pointed out a lot of flaws in this bill, but there's some good ideas. There's no doubt about that. But it could go further. And I think that point goes to the fundamental underlying concept of this whole effort. We have a breakdown not solely in administration in the House of Representatives, Mr. Chairman. What we have is a breakdown in the checks and the balances that keep this place functioning in an ordinary and flowing way. We have more than a breakdown of checks and balances. We have had a suppression of checks and balances. There's a fundamental unfairness that we Republicans have perceived for a very long time, and perhaps throughout the 38 years that your party has been in a majority, or certainly in the last 15 that I've been here. And that unfairness really goes perhaps to the way we run the place, perhaps to the rules of the House, the very rules that are administered by this committee. It also goes to the administration of the House under the House Administration Committee. It goes to incidental problems like the voting of proxies, wherein you might have a whole subcommittee filled with Republicans sitting at the table doing their business, ready to debate on one side of the table, and nobody else but the chairman armed with lots of pieces of paper. Not debating the issues, but simply voting the issues because he's got the votes, because he's got the sheaf of papers in his hands, and nobody's there, but he wins, no matter how many warm bodies you might have on the minority side. And so in answer to Mr. Frost's complaint a little while ago, the Republicans did maybe file the Michael Amendment, and we're going to propose the Michael Amendment. That has a whole raft. That's our wish list. That's everything that we would like to get in. But you know as well as I do that when we sat down to negotiate, we weren't arguing from that raft, that sheaf of papers. We wanted just one or two substantive changes now, because this is the train that's leaving the station. We're not, you know, we can get promises for looking into future changes, but we've been through that before. We're not fooling ourselves. Those changes may or may not come to pass. But this bill is going through the Congress, and this bill is going to improve the way we do business. Not as much as I'd like, but it's going to improve a little bit. But I think that if we're going to go to this effort, and if we're really going to go to the American people and tell them, hey, we want bipartisan change, we want to uplift the integrity of the House of Representatives, it seems to me what we really want is to do it together. And we haven't done that. We've dropped the ball. And we could have done it if only we had a little bit more showing, in my opinion, of a real sincere effort to compromise. And I didn't see it. It's not in that bill. The House administration governs everything, not the bipartisan, even split subcommittee of House administration for all these committees, but the unevenly split full committee, which has the appeal process over all of the disputes that might arise. And, you know, this is a very important committee. A very important committee that governs the jurisdiction over all bills. It governs the agenda. I can understand why you would want a majority of Democrats in this committee. That doesn't bother me. There are currently 40% of the members of Congress who call themselves Republicans. To be specific, 38.5. But in this committee, there are only 30% Republicans. There's a makeup of 9 Democrats, and there's a makeup of 4 Republicans. 9 to 4. Now that's not even remotely representative of the proportion of members of the House of Representatives. And it seems to me that it means that all of the work that goes through the United States Congress, at least through the House of Representatives, is unduly slanted away from our ability to get anything done.
Mr. Livingston, were you in the task force when I pointed out in the 80th Congress where the Republicans had an 8-vote majority that their Rules Committee was 8 to 4?
Yes, sir. I was. And that was 40 years ago. And we did a lot of things differently. And we didn't do them necessarily fairly. And I think that if we're really conscientious about coming into the year 1992 and making the House of Representatives function as a fair organization without the horrible patronage problems that we've had, without the ineptitude and the bureaucracy, that maybe we ought to be thinking about doing things differently than the way we did it in 1954. Now, 9 to 4 doesn't represent the makeup in the House of Representatives of Democrats to Republicans. And we weren't asking for a total change. All we asked for was really another 1 or 2 Republican members. 9 to 6 we thought was a pretty fair suggestion. We thought it was a fair suggestion. We caved. We said, okay, we won't have the elimination of proxy voting on every single committee and subcommittee. We'll just forget about the subcommittees. Just give it to us at full committee. But we don't have that in here. We don't have the makeup.
Don't you agree, Mr. Livingston, that we were coming very close until it came to talking about restructuring committees?
I think that it came close until we started talking procedure. I think that as long as the majority was content in talking about administrative changes, everything was great. But we told you from the beginning, we want a little bit more than that, Mr. Chairman. This is the only vehicle we've got. And if we could just redress some of the procedural wrongs that make this a very unfair place for the minority to do business, then in my opinion, we could have had an agreement. And we still may. But I think that the majority has to search into their souls and determine, hey, do we really want a bipartisan place? Do we really want to make this place better? Do we really want to uplift the integrity, or do we want control? Because that's it. If we want control and we don't want to give the minority 2 steps ahead or a chance to get anything through the House of Representatives, then we might as well all go home because this is meaningless. Thank you.
Mr. DeLay.
Mr. Chairman, since my junior member, has been here much longer than me, I'll defer to him.
Go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yep, go ahead.
Well, I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I bring an amendment to the committee. It's been discussed, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. I tend to agree with Mr. Obey from Wisconsin in that you need to separate a lot of these issues. And when you start packaging things in big bills, you load them up, and it's very difficult. A lot of times, and I'm not accusing this committee or anybody else of doing this, but a lot of times we package committees and load them up so that they will fail, because we don't want something to be changed or something to pass. We all know how that works. I wish that we could separate the issues, and that's why I bring my amendment to ban proxies. I wish that we could take each one of these issues and separate them and have a vote on each individual issues. I think one of the biggest problems that the majority has in facing the problems of the institution as a whole is that for many years, most of the years that I've been in this House, we have thwarted the will of the House. And when you thwart the will of the House, you get in trouble. And that's what is happening here. And of all issues, if you are looking to truly reform the House, of all issues that you do not want to thwart the will of the institution, is this particular issue of reforming the institution and reforming the administration of this institution. The members should be allowed to vote on each particular issue. I remember when I was in the Texas legislature, we had a rule that allowed us to divide the question. If a bill had more than one title in it, you could, on a majority vote, call for a vote and divide the question and have a vote on each title of that bill. I think that's a very real reform that ought to come to this House, so that the majority is not allowed to load up bills and package them with so much stuff and hide things in there that we can't divide the question. I think we need to divide the question on this issue. I think it's vitally important. To the issue of proxy voting, I think if the American people knew that we had a system in this House that allowed members to be absent from voting in their committees and doing what they were elected to do, they would be totally outraged. I don't think the American people understand that members of this House are allowed to be absent and have their vote voted for them, not being at the committee, on subcommittee level or the full committee. I serve on appropriations. We don't have proxy voting. And we don't get in trouble on our committee because we don't have proxy voting. Members have to be there, present, warm body, voting and discussing the issues. I think when you give up the opportunity of members not being present and being part of the debate, you get into trouble. Members get into trouble. They've given up some of their responsibility, and usually that gets you in trouble. I think bad things can happen if the members are allowed to be absent. And I know that some have said, including Mr. Obey, maybe that banning proxies is not a good thing now because we've got so many members on so many committees. Well, excuse me. Those members asked to be on all those committees. And if they asked to be on all those committees, they ought to be required to be sitting there voting. And I think their constituents ought to know that they are not sitting there voting, that their proxies are being voted for them. And they don't have to be in a committee to vote because we have a rule that allows proxy voting. And if they've got all these committees that they serve on, then by God, they ought to get out there and work to serve on those committees and be there to vote. So I offer amendment. I hope you will consider it to ban proxy voting in this House.
Thank you. The Honorable Jim Nussel of Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to say I appreciate your indulging us the opportunity to speak to you on this issue. This is my first opportunity to address you and the rest of the Rules Committee, and I appreciate that opportunity. I would just have to say that based on my sitting in this room for the last few hours and listening to the discussion, I hear a couple of themes. First of all, that the Democrats that have testified here today indicate that there doesn't appear to be much time. It seems to be kind of a complicated issue. It's something that we really shouldn't burden the House with, and that maybe next year we can address it. The Republicans, on the other hand, indicate that we're a little bit frustrated about being in the minority, we're a little bit tired of not being in power, and that consequently we have a couple of changes that we would like to suggest. I would suggest to both sides on this particular issue that both of their concerns, both of the time factor and not addressing this till maybe another day and it being too complicated, as well as the issue of not being in power, may be addressed come this November. And that the reform issue, while it might not be addressed today because of a closed rule or other finagling, it is possible that we will have citizen representatives here next year to address these issues. I would just point out to the committee that the emperor has no clothes. And if this particular bill is supposed to clothe the Congress, which is now standing naked before the people, I would suggest that this is nothing but a fig leaf. I've been working together with a group of freshman Republicans to try and craft outside, overt changes that can bring back the integrity, because quite honest, right now, what we've got is we have the people of the United States being totally tired, sick and tired of the very thing that you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, that we're not addressing the real issues of the country. So I've been trying to ask myself why. Why haven't we? And I would suggest to you that it's because we're not a citizen legislature anymore. We're no longer citizen representatives. Not because we don't want to be, but because through the system, the way it is, go along to get along, the good old boy network that we created, we can no longer be that citizen representative. So what I am proposing are these four bills to bring us back as ideas to add on to the many fine pieces of legislation that have been crafted here and have been proposed here. And I would propose them as amendments. First of all, we stop the special treatment. The special treatment that sets us apart from our constituents in Iowa and in Massachusetts and all over the country. Second, that we get merit pay. Every single constituent in this country receives pay based on the kind of job they do. Merit pay. Number three, that we eliminate this free mailing privilege called the frank. And to be frank, it's politicizing the ability to go out and to advertise our particular job that we do here. Not the communication with constituents do I touch, but the politicizing of our particular job. And finally, this provision should make us all happy because of the hour. My last provision is called simply go home. That we spend too much time in Washington. That part of our job responsibility is to be home. Not only home with our families, worshiping and working and raising our families in the communities that we were elected to serve, but to also go home and to live among them so that we can see what they're like. I propose these things for a number of reasons. And I listened to a number of these same arguments here today. First of all, on the special treatment, the stopping the special treatment. Just here today, we talked about incumbent pampering and protection in a campaign finance reform that would add yet another special treatment to incumbents. My stop special treatment does three things. It eliminates the exemptions that we have from the laws that we pass. Number one, like Freedom of Information Act, which would address Mr. Roberts' concerns that nobody can look in here, let the sun shine in the front door. Like the Ethics in Government Act, like the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those are all acts that we exempt ourselves from. Second, the perks. The way I address the perks is not to make that the big issue. I know that the freshman Republicans have been hammered of being the ones that have been pointing out the perks. We don't care about the perks because of the perks themselves. We care about the perks because of the way it shows to the American people that we live differently than they do. So what I'm proposing is very simple. Have a GAO report, a study that looks at all of the perks, report it back to the Congress, and then let the people decide through the House of Representatives. My second is merit pay. That's my second amendment that I'm proposing. You'll love this one. And this was proposed by an Iowan that said, you know what would work to balance the budget? If we all got our pay docked if we didn't get the job done. So I wrote a bill. My bill says simply that starting in 1997, so that we give fair warning to everybody that this is how it's going to work, we dock our pay 5% every year that we can't do the most basic, fundamental job that we were all elected to do, and that is spend the investment of tax dollars wisely. 5% every year that we're out of balance. That would get the job done because we would have some ownership in that responsibility. My fourth
You may balance the budget, but you don't balance every congressman.
Well, you know, I hear that at home too, and that is that if we can't balance our own personal checkbooks, it's no wonder we can't balance the budget. The third one is use a stamp, and that's quite easy. Just because we want to eliminate the frank, my constituents, they made up that title as well. They said, call it use a stamp, because we don't get to sign our name to the top of the envelope and send it out. Plus, we all know, let's not kid ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves. There's a lot of politicking done in that particular envelope that goes out. A lot of politicking, not only outside of the district, which was eliminated hopefully today, but also within the district. Mr. Chairman, be honest with everybody. I think we can be honest with each other. The final one is called Go Home, and like I said, I think you'll love this, and maybe it's a good way to wrap up this discussion. Do you realize that there is a law out there right now that calls for the adjournment date in the Reorganization Act of 1946 for the adjournment date of Congress on July 31st? That was when we were really supposed to go home. It's unbelievable that every year we waive it magically without any discussion. I've made it a little bit simpler. I've called it, let's do it within the fiscal year. By October 1st, we should have our work done. Work on legislation, appropriations, budget, everything, so that we can go home and live with our constituents. But here's the trick, again similar to merit pay. I say that if we stay in after October 1st, for every day that we stay in, we get our pay docked. A day's pay for a day's work. If we stay in past the fiscal year, every day we get docked 1/365th of our pay. The reason I call this the Citizen Representative Reform Act is because citizens gave me these ideas. The American people gave me these ideas and are, believe it or not, putting these ideas in platforms across the country. You may not put it in this bill. You may give a closed rule. But mark my words, Mr. Chairman, next year, when those 78, 100, 120, maybe even 150 or more freshmen, Republicans and Democrats, because your freshman Democrats are just as frustrated with this piece of work, calling it a fig leaf, I think that we will have those changes. So you may not consider it today, but we will consider it, I believe, next year. And I appreciate your time and indulgence. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I may not agree completely with you, but you've done an outstanding job. Any questions of the panel?
I want to just make a short observation, if I may. I've enjoyed listening to you, and it's great, great theater, and a lot of it I agree with. And you know, but you're Republicans, and you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to come up here and raise as much cane as you possibly can, and you have done an excellent job at it. But let me read you just some excerpts from a nonpartisan periodical out of an editorial that appeared in Roll Call on the 6th of this week. While we were skeptical of earlier proposals for a House administrator, which seemed to us merely an extra layer of bureaucracy, we think the new Foley plan makes sense. The Democrats' plan does give the GOP unprecedented powers in two ways. First, the minority leader has veto power over the director, and second, a special subcommittee of the House Administration Committee with membership split between the two parties would have oversight authority over the director and 3 officers. It is hard to see how anyone who wants the House to run in a smooth, efficient, and we must assume that you really do want that, and scandal-free manner can oppose the Foley plan. Republicans attacked it last week, but it's clear that most of their complaints are not so much substantive as tactical. In the end, there is no excuse for turning down the Foley's excellent administrative reform. So I give that to you for your perusal. That's all.
Well, could I respond to that?
Well, certainly, I guess.
I appreciate that because, first of all, I think at times we have some concern about whether or not that's a truly nonpartisan source that you just quoted. But I would make 2 observations. Number one, the minority leader, if you will check with him, doesn't regard this truly unprecedented power that he's being given in here as particularly great. In fact, one of the proposals at the end of the task force meetings was he was willing to give that up in order to get, for instance, proxy reform, which he thought was a lot more important. And so that is, you know, while your side of the aisle may regard it as unprecedented that you're giving him that power, he doesn't see it as being a major...
That was not our side of the aisle. That was a nonpartisan periodical and is recognized by everyone in government as being nonpartisan.
All I'm saying to you, what I'm saying to you is that there are a lot of people sitting here who would not agree with that. And secondly, I'm just saying to you that their analysis may not be correct. Secondly, I wonder if they have looked at your bill when they say that this bipartisan subcommittee is in fact a real reform. They have not seen your bill at that point because the bipartisan subcommittee is undermined completely by your bill when all of its decisions that result in tie move up to the partisan House Administration Committee. This bill does not reflect what that editorial said.
Bob, I understand that you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do. You're up here. I mean, you're the minority, and you know that we could sit here for 10 years and we couldn't come out with something that's going to suit you. And you're doing what you're supposed to do. You're doing what you're supposed to do. You're doing a great job. I compliment you.
There was a distinct possibility within that task force, I think, around that room of getting a proposal that we would have agreed to. And we could have had a bipartisan show. This document is not bipartisanship. This document is your decision as a majority that you need to do something, and so you're going to do something that gets the votes on your side, but it has absolutely no meaning to us as
that is a partisan view that you have just given us. I've given you a nonpartisan view.
Sure you have.
Tell him to turn off his mic. Cut him off, will you, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, you had mentioned earlier on that you, as a member of the bipartisan committee, and Mr. Walker, Mr. Livingston as members, and myself as well, that you thought progress was being made, and all of a sudden it stopped. Well, Mr. Chairman...
I must admit I missed the last meeting.
Huh? Well, yeah, I think you did. but that's when it stopped, and it was obvious that that Speaker Foley and Majority Leader Gephardt had come from their caucus, and their caucus had rejected all of the things that Mr. Foley and Mr. Gephardt were sort of leaning towards working out a real bipartisan agreement. That's exactly what happened. And I believe that was led by our good friend Charlie Rose, who is the chairman of the full committee on House administration, and who is in charge of all of this patronage that we're dealing with here today. Now, you know, the Inspector General, which I said had no teeth earlier, and Bob Walker, you brought up you brought it up vividly. Be a little quiet over there where we can hear that the performance audit, you know, which was part of the teeth in what Speaker Foley and Mr. Gephardt were going to give us, was summarily dropped. Now, that was done by the Democrat caucus. The partisan Charlie Rose, wearing 3 hats, reporting to himself. In three areas as we look through this bill. And then, you know, we look at the General Counsel, which is so terribly important to to make sure that this House is going to operate within the law. And let me just read you the language, okay, in this document that we're being forced to vote on tomorrow. It says the Committee on House Administration shall provide for an Office of General Counsel. Well, what a sweetheart deal for all the young Democrat lawyers around Washington. Because you're going to see, I can't hear over there when you're talking, if you just keep it a little lower, out of courtesy. You know, what a sweetheart deal for all the Democrat young lawyers. Because that's going to proliferate into some huge bureaucracy. Okay, that'll be fine. All we were asking for was one slot, not expanding any bureaucracy here with all these young lawyers, which is a real problem around Washington as it is. Excuse me, all you lawyers out there. But we have a slot right now which isn't filled. It isn't filled because it doesn't have any authority, and we don't want to waste the taxpayers' money. All we wanted was to have that spot treated as co-equal, so that he would be in on all of the problems that are brought before the House that have got us into this bank scandal and into the post office and all these other things.
Mr. Chairman?
Then let me just get on to the proxy thing for 1 minute, because I hear all these people saying, yeah, that's a good idea, but now's not the time. You know, if this House were run right, even with this huge bureaucracy of committees and subcommittees we've got, every member would still be able to get to his subcommittees. If we had legislative scheduling, which is what I wanted to do in our task force, Bob and Livingston, you remember, if we were to meet in this House from 10 in the morning until 10 at night, 1 day a week, we could do the bidding of the House, and the other 4 days our committees could meet until the cows come home. But the House is not run right. And the reason it isn't is because nobody wants to bite the bullet here and study it and come up with recommendations. So, you know, the very testimony that you've given us here this evening just shows how badly we need an open rule on the floor where we could debate Jim Nussel's recommendations that he brings here from the people he represents and debate it and let the best man or woman win. But instead of that, we're not going to debate any of these issues. We're going to be shut out entirely. And that's just a shame. And the American people ought to be ashamed of us for letting it happen. So I really thank you for all of your testimony. And
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield for just a moment?
I'd be glad to yield, my friend.
We've been here all afternoon, as you know, and we have always, as a matter of courtesy to the minority, whenever your party has had a major function in the evening, we have tried to wind up the business of the House so that your members could attend the function. Our party has a major function this evening. I would urge that we go ahead and get down to the votes on this matter so that that type of policy, which has always been the case on both sides, could be honored.
I would say to my friend, I did not know there was a major function that the Democratic Party was holding tonight. And certainly there's been no effort on the part of the Republicans to extend this, but we'll certainly try to expedite it. But on the other hand, we do have to have the members heard. I don't have any further questions of the gentleman. Let me just yield to Mr. Walker for a minute.
You make a very important point with regard to the performance audits being taken away from the Inspector General. Because the fact is that nothing which is in this bill, as we will just consider it tomorrow, would have allowed the Inspector General to investigate the House Bank in a way that would have shown the problems to be there. And without the performance audit, we would be stuck with exactly the same situation that we had before, and we are cruising for another major scandal at some point in the future. I thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman.
If I might, I think it was a financial audit, not a functional audit, that uncovered the problems at the bank.
No, that's not. Only to say very quickly and very briefly, Mr. Chairman, that, sorry. We understand where some of our colleagues are coming from. That's okay. But people who are watching, people who are listening in, should understand that these, in fact, are major and very real reforms. They may not go so far as some others would like. That may not be exactly what some others would prefer, but in fact they are very real, and they do seek to speak to the problems which have have recently erupted here in the House of Representatives, and one way or another we're going to solve them, and as suggested to our friends earlier on, you'll have a lot of support from this side of the aisle for proceeding beyond that to solve some of the other problems we face. I just don't want people out there thinking that this is a fiasco, that we're not really truly dealing with these problems. We are truly dealing with some of the problems, and the major contention, I think it's fair to say, from some of our friends on the other side of the aisle, is that we're ignoring some still. I agree about that. As we tried to make the point earlier, we can't put them all in one, in one package, and we'll get back to those very, very quickly, in my opinion. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You all have made very, very good points. Matter of fact, some of the best points have been made here in this testimony today, and I congratulate you. So, with the program pending for the Democrats, I know how important it is to go to the Republican functions, and I shall conclude my remarks by saying congratulations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief too, like everyone else here, but it seems to me that if there was ever a time for an open rule on any issue, this is it. If the majority truly wants to be bipartisan in trying to address the reforms that we are trying to bring about, it would mean that they would give us the opportunity to offer the amendments we want. And I would say to my friend Tony, if you all want to defeat these, let's defeat them all on the House floor, but not here in the Rules Committee. If these things, these items, which our members, Jim Nussle's gotten from his Iowa constituents, he wants to bring them forward, and based on the rule that's been handed out right now, his constituents aren't going to have a chance on the House floor to have their voice heard.
My friend is not suggesting, is he, that every constituent who suggests something to every member around here should have an opportunity to have his idea heard and voted on the floor?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'll say. I'll tell you what I will say on this issue, Tony.
Yeah.
On this one, I think so. I'll tell you why. We are trying to be as bipartisan as possible on this. And there have been recommendations which have come to me from constituents. There have been recommendations which have come to all of us. And I think that on the House floor, there should be an opportunity for those things to be heard if we're going to bring about a bipartisan package of reforms. And you said, we're addressing some of them and some remain unanswered. I argue that if we don't do this now, we probably won't address reform months and years ahead. Jerry Solomon was saying earlier that we're going to try our best to look at reforms in the future, but the bank scandal, the post office, the other things will be history at that point, and so there won't be that pressure. Right now, we are trying to do it. Bob Michael, obviously, from what Bob Walker just said, was frustrated over this proxy question, over a lot of these other things that came out of this, this package. So what I'm saying is, hey, go ahead and defeat them, but at least allow us to have the chance to offer them on the House floor. That's the case we're making. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, in looking over Mr. Michael's alternative proposal, one of the things that caught my eye, which really frustrates me, is Section 232, where it calls for the elimination of certain select committees. And as you know, one of the committees that you call for is the elimination of the Hunger Committee, of which I chair, which absolutely drives me up the wall. It drives me up the wall is because our committee, of the Hunger Committee, has the least budget allowance committee. As a matter of fact, it plays very, very fair with the Republican Party from the standpoint of staff members. It's probably the hardest working committee. And I'm not here to defend all select committees, but I am here to defend this. With 100 million people, or 100 million children that are going to die in the next decade from malnutrition and hunger, this committee has been on the forefront of child survival activities and many programs in our own country that in fact are saving lives. And the reason why it was formed is you have 8 committees in the Congress that have some aspect of hunger, from food stamps to development assistance. You never had one committee that ever dealt with the issue. And that's why the committee was formed. From Mr. Thomas and the committees that it appeared before, or that I appeared before relative to committee funding, there was nothing but praise for this committee. We have praise from many people because it's a very, very bipartisan committee. As a matter of fact, there's a summit going on right now in Ethiopia between Sudan and Ethiopia and Djibouti and Somalia as a result of the Select Committee's action. So I am just very frustrated when I see that, when I know of the good work that oftentimes goes unreported, work that has been very, very good, work that actually is saving lives, and you guys want to eliminate it. I just wanted to make that statement. If they have a comment, I'll be glad to listen to it. But
Tony, if you'd yield, I'd be glad to. You know, we have serious problems with illegal drugs in this country, and there is a Select Committee on Narcotics Abuse. I don't know how many years that committee has been in existence. Your committee does a good job. But, you know, select committees, according to the rules of this House, are established for short-term purposes to be disbanded at the end of the Congress. And every year we just keep proliferating and adding to and continuing these committees. You know and I know that an issue that important ought to be assigned to the standing committees. If you need a standing committee that's going to continue for year after year after year, establish it. But don't do it under this Select Committee. That's all Mr. Michael is talking about. We have to do the same thing with illegal drugs.
Mr. Solomon, when I appeared before this committee and I talked about the Select Committee on Hunger, I was asked by Mr. Dwyer, when should this committee when should it be eliminated? And I said, it's my hope that we'll eliminate hunger by the year 2000. And I think by at least that time we'll put a dent in it. We'll cut the infant mortality deaths by half. Eliminate it then. And I think that we can do our job. We have set programs in motion right now, both private and public, that are absolutely doing a job. There is no committee like this in the United States, publicly, that deals with the issue of hunger, both domestic and international. And you guys want to eliminate it like that.
If I may respond, Mr. Chairman, and I don't disagree with you, Tony. The work that y'all have done has just been fantastic. But you answered your own question. The operation of this House has gotten so bogged down and so complicated and so overweighted with so many subcommittees and so many committees that you could not even have one standing committee that could address the problem you were talking about. So you had to go out and create another committee called the Select Committee on Hunger. What we're talking about is this House as an institution should streamline itself. These joint referrals and joint jurisdictions that are going passed back and forth has so bogged down this House that it can't operate, and you have to create select committees to get good work done. That's why we want to eliminate select committees and streamline the House.
And let me say, you can't have it all ways. Mr. Obey
Mr. Chairman.
I have time.
I think one of our members.
If I may, if the gentleman would yield to me.
Glad to yield.
Thank you. In all fairness and all truth, I don't think it's necessary to yield time to each member of the panel to respond to a comment made by the gentleman on the committee. It's perfectly all right for Mr. Solomon too, but in all seriousness, we don't need to get involved in a dialogue between each of the four members of the panel and our friend Mr. Hall, or you or anybody else. Okay, so if you answered, that was quite proper. Jerry, I mean, it was a good response, but we don't have to go down the whole row and hear a response to Tony Hall's comments.
The chair will take care of that, and I'm not going to keep the members from speaking if they want to say something. Well, I hope not. Yes.
Could I just respond to Mr. Hall? We tried in the Michael proposal to keep a certain amount of symmetry. It's the kind of thing that Mr. Obey testified to earlier here today. He said that we could not do proxies without doing something about substantive reform of all the committee assignments in the House. We attempted within the Michael proposal to speak to that very thing. If we're going to eliminate proxies and we're going to do some of these procedural things, we also recognize that we have to do something about reforms of the structures that keep members from being able to show up at the committees at appropriate times. And so the proposal is not aimed at your select committee or any other particular select committee. It is aimed at trying to do the right thing to assure that the totality of our program can work for the members of the House.
The only thing I would say in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, is that when you have something that's working, and when you have a committee and a group of people that are very dedicated and very fulfilled because of their work, why would you throw the baby out with the bathwater? It just doesn't make sense.
Ms. Slaughter, had you concluded? Ms. Slaughter? Thank you, gentlemen, very much. That concludes testimony on, what's the number of the bill? on HRES 423. Thank you very much for your excellent testimony. Mr. Bealerson, have a motion?
He has three of them, Mr. Chairman. The first one is the following. With respect to H.R. 2967. Good-looking chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a rule authorizing the Speaker on Thursday, April 9, 1992, to entertain one motion to suspend the rules to dispose of the Senate amendment to H.R. 2967.
Committee has heard the resolution of the gentleman. Is there discussion?
Mr. Chairman, this is on the Older Americans Act.
It is, sir. Yes.
On behalf of Mr. Archer, I am going to make the following motion. I do move to substitute the rule providing for the consideration of H.R. 2967 together with the Senate amendment thereto in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, subject to 1 hour of general debate divided between the chairman and ranking minority, allowing only amendments to the Senate amendment. Members of the Ways and Means Committee waiving necessary points of order against the bill and amendment, and providing the traditional motion to recommit to the minority with or without instructions. And I don't think that needs debate. We debated it while they were here testifying, and at the appropriate time I would so move.
Is there further discussion on the gentleman's motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no?
No.
Noes appear to have it. The motion fails. Are there further motions or amendments? All right, we will vote on the motion of the gentleman from California, Mr. Bealerson. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no?
No.
The ayes have it. H.R. 2967 is passed out. And who is going to handle it? Mr. Gordon.
And Mr. Quillen will manage for the minority.
All right, Mr. Bealerson.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a rule waiving all points of order against the conference report on S3 and against its consideration. The rule also provides that the conference report will be considered as read. This has to do, as the members will recall, with the electoral reform, with the campaign reform.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman from California. Is there discussion, amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I understand that one of the rules being waived is a 3-day layover, and that's fine. Is there another rule being waived that we know of?
There's only one.
Scope?
Scope violation is all.
Is that a serious violation?
I don't think so, no.
You know, we waive so many scopes around here. I'd just like to know which one.
Senate PAC provision.
It's a Senate what?
PAC provision.
Oh, I understand it's a Senate PAC provision. I understand that, and I don't have any objection there.
All right, there's the
gentleman is correct. That was the limit of it.
Okay, thank you.
Is there further discussion? All those in favor of the motion of the gentleman from California signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. Motion is carried. Mr. Frost, gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dreyer from California will manage for the minority.
Mr. Bealerson.
Finally, Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a rule providing for consideration of the House Administrative Reform Resolution in the House. The rule waives all points of order against the resolution and against its consideration. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the majority and minority leaders. Only one amendment is made in order. The amendment will be printed in the report to accompany the rule and will be offered by Representative Michael. The amendment is debatable for 1 hour. Finally, the rule waives all points of order against the amendment.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman from California. Are there amendments?
Mr. Chairman, we've heard all the arguments for an open rule. I would move an open rule, which would make in order all of the germane amendments that were offered before this committee in testimony earlier today. It would provide additionally for 2 hours of general debate, and would make the Michael substitute in order under that open rule with his 1 hour of debate. And I would really hope that the panel would consider that open rule. I think it's terribly important for the future integrity of this House.
You heard the motion of the gentleman from New York. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Gentlemen?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, some of the points that are made as to reasons why we don't need to have open rules is that sometimes the legislation is sophisticated and it's a complicated compromise, and it's in armed services or it's in foreign affairs or it's something, and it shouldn't be thrown up to the whims of the floor. This legislation has to do with the operations of the Congress, in which everyone has equal standing. And if there ever is a reason in the history of the Congress to have an open rule, this ought to be it. So I would hope that our members would join us.
Is there further discussion on the motion of the gentleman from New York? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The noes have it. The motion fails.
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully ask for a recorded vote on that.
Gentleman asked for recorded vote. Clerk will call.
Mr. Derrick.
No.
Mr. Beals.
No.
Mr. Frost. Mr. Bond.
No.
Mr. Hall.
No.
Mr. Wheat. Mr. Gordon. Ms. Slaughter.
No.
Mr. Solomon.
Aye.
Mr. Quill. Aye. Mr. Dryer. Aye. Mr. McEwen.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Frost just came in.
Mr. Frost.
The vote is no.
Four having voted in the affirmative and 7 in the negative, the motion fails. Are there further motions?
Mr. Chairman, during the testimony, you had heard that the Republicans of the bipartisan task force had attempted to try to get some meaningful procedural reforms into the bipartisan package. One of those was a proposal that was submitted by me that would have required the House to establish either the bipartisan, continue the bipartisan task force, the 8 and 8 members, or to establish a new task force made up of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats to look into the serious priorities of procedural reform, dealing with proxy voting, with the number of subcommittees, et cetera, et cetera. My original proposal would have required that task force to report back to the entire body by July 31st with their findings, and would have required a vote on it on the floor by September 30th before we adjourn. That was not acceptable to the Democrats on the bipartisan task force. We came back with a second proposal, and that is a proposal that I'm making before the body now, to make in order my second proposal, which does the same thing, only does not require the task force to report it to the floor requiring a recorded vote. All it does is require the establishment of that task force to study those priority issues that are paralyzing this House today, and reporting it then to the Democrat and Republican caucuses before we adjourn. That way we would at least have some kind of head start and some kind of guarantee that this Congress is serious about looking into the terrible problems that we have now that do paralyze this House. So I would make that motion and hope that the body would consider adding it to the debate on the floor of the House tomorrow.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman from New York. Is there further discussion? No further discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. No.
Mr.
Noes
Chairman,
apparently have it, and the motion fails.
Mr. Chairman, I have to ask for recorded vote.
The gentleman asks for a recorded vote. The clerk will read.
Mr. Derrick.
No.
Mr. Beals. No. Mr. Frost. No. Mr. Bond. No. Mr. Hall. No. Mr. Wheat. No.
Okay.
Mr. Gordon.
What do we do?
Ms. Slaughter.
No.
Mr. Solomon.
You just talked.
Aye.
Mr. Quill.
Aye.
Mr. Dryer. Aye. Mr. McEwen.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
No. Four having voted in the affirmative and 8 in the negative, the motion fails. Are there further motions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Out of respect, I have several amendments that we'd like to go through and offer these.
Gentleman from California.
And what I'd like to do is, out of respect, we see the chairman sitting over there in black tie getting ready for your dinner, and I don't want to delay anyone, but what I would like to do is offer the amendments which were proposed by our colleagues, and I will read through them if you'd like for me to read through them briefly. Mr. Thomas's, which makes the House Administration Committee bipartisan. Mr. DeLay's, which bans proxy voting in committees and subcommittees. Mr. Thomas's, which drops provisions in majority resolution allowing appeals from bipartisan oversight committees to the full administration committee. Mr. Roberts' amendment, which privatizes various House services. And Mr. Nussel's package of amendments 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Mr. Walker's 2 amendments, which he proposed here, which I can read through, but he outlined and submitted to us. And I would move, happy to yield to the ranking member.
If the gentleman would include in there an amendment which would expand the general debate time from 1 hour to 2 hours.
If no one would object, I'd be happy to include that in my package.
Well, I don't object. So.
And Mr. Chairman, I would move that I'd ask unanimous consent that all of these be considered in block. And if there are any members on your side who would like to support any of these amendments, they could object and we could consider them separately.
Or if they'd like to add amendments to it, they're welcome.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take any other amendments that people might want to include in this package.
You've heard the motion of the gentleman from California. Is there further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. Noes apparently have it. The motion.
Mr. Chairman, I think I might ask for a recording.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Derrick.
No.
Mr. Beelance. No. Mr. Frost. No. Mr. Bonner. No. Mr. Hall. No. Mr. Wheat. No. Mr. Gordon. Ms. Slaughter. No. Mr. Solomon.
Aye.
Mr. Quillen.
Aye.
Mr. Dryer.
Aye.
Mr. McEwen. Mr. Chairman.
No. Three having voted in the affirmative and 8 in the negative, the motion fails. Are there further motions? Further discussion? Hearing none, vote on the motion of the gentleman from California, Mr. Beelance. And all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no?
No.
The ayes apparently have it. The clerk will call.
Mr. Derrick.
Yes.
Mr. Beelance.
Aye.
Mr. Frost.
Aye.
Mr. Bonner.
Yes.
Mr. Hall.
Yes.
Mr. Wheat.
Aye.
Mr. Gordon. Ms. Slaughter.
Aye. No. Just on the wrong side of the aisle there. He's confused.
Mr. Quillen.
Aye.
Mr. Dryer.
No, I'm sorry. Not me all to.
Mr. Dryer. No. Mr. McEwen. No. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Thank you.
How close was it, Mr. Chairman?
It was not close. 8 having voted in the affirmative and 4 in the negative, the motion carries. The chairman, Mr. Moakley, will handle it.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman, Mr. Solomon, will carry for the minority.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask unanimous consent be recorded in favor and voting in favor of Mr. Dwyer's package here?
Without objection, the
Thank you very
gentleman will be shown. Any further business before the committee? The committee is adjourned.
The House Rules Committee approved debate procedures for the proposal to create a House Administrator. The committee also voted on rules for the Older Americans Act and for a Campaign Finance Reform Act, which had been debated briefly at the beginning of the meeting. Coming up in a moment on C-SPAN 2, coverage of today's convention of the American Society of Newspaper Editors.